even if you want to say that it was good to defend against them, I mean, almost immediately after you get funding for the annihilation of Gaza. You get a total support for Israel's annihilation of Gaza. And there's just no starker example of the fact that the quote unquote good empire can be had without the quote unquote bad empire, which means you need to get rid of the empire.
And I'm having him on right now to talk about it. Hello.
Hey, Hasan, could you hear me all right?
Yes, I can hear you perfectly. Daniel Bessner is in the building. Ladies and gentlemen, Danny, been a long time, and this is your first time on the broadcast. How would you present yourself to the people that might not know of the good word that you put out there on the American Prestige?
Yeah, for sure. Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. Really appreciate it. So basically, I'm a historian. But beyond that, I've kind of spent the last 10 or so years thinking about what a genuinely left-wing approach to American foreign policy would be in an age of imperial decline and an age of capitalist domination, and how the left should respond in an era when the United States still remains the world hegemon and is doing things like supporting the IDF, sending arms to Ukraine, having 750 military bases abroad, the dollar is hegemonic, and things like that. So basically,
so you're saying you're a woke, tanky, red fash, all of those things. Like you're, when people encounter your work and they have like the globe emoji on their Twitter profile, they see what you have to say and they go, "This is the scariest person on the planet."
That's precisely right. But I'm a little bit weird because I'm also sanctioned by Russia. One of the few Americans who has been personally sanctioned by Russia. So they don't know what to do with me. But yeah, the globe emoji people do not love me. And, a lot of people don't love me, but I'm fighting the good fight just like you are, sir.
Yeah. Well, I haven't been sanctioned by Russia, but they did actually dunk on me in one of their crazy ads that they had done. I actually kind of want to show this to you right now. Chatters, do you have that ad? Let's show it to Daniel. I want to see if you can notice where they end up using a version of me as a way to say, like, which side are you on? Let me see if I can find it. Hold on.
No, I'd love to see that. It was a shock. I think I'm on the same list as like Larry Summers. There's a couple of dead guys on there as well. So, it's an honorable list to say the least.
Yeah. Let's see. Hasan Piker, Russian military ad. Maybe this is the one.
Oh, they're using you as a recruiting tool.
No, they're in the reverse. they're using my likeness. And saying like, which side are you on? You want to be a gay guy that live streams, or you want to be like a big burly man that dies in one of the grayest places you've ever seen, so that the Russian government can get like a piece of extra territory. But hold on.
Why not both?
Yeah. How about be a gay guy who live streams and do that?
What's the problem?
He's doing both. Here, I think I found it. Okay. Hold on. I'm going to share my screen with you so you can see it as well.
Yeah, let me see it.
Here it is. Okay. Let's see if I can find the actual moment. Oh, here it is. Russian military recruitment ads. Okay. And it's incredible. Let's take a look. What are our men?
Из колотых ушек, из смузи сделаны наши мужчины. Из мейнстримов.
That's crazy. Okay? How did I make the goddamn Russian government my op? That's insane. Okay? Who is over there like former HasanAbi head? They got my worst era too. They got my worst era. FSBs hate watching out here, bro. What the make me bright makeup and streams? Like they did like a mishmash of different and struggle periods throughout my streaming.
It's like
career.
the Taylor Swift tour. But
yeah, they put on they said like you put on makeup and you wear a lot of jewelry and you paint your fingernails and then you pose in front of your nice supercar. I guess the sanctions were hitting them hard, so they couldn't put the Porsche there, so they used whatever this car is. I think maybe it's a Corvette. I can't tell.
It looks like AI.
Yeah, could be. But this is so we both got both been unjustly maligned by the Russian state while simultaneously
Yeah, I
being
can't go there.
called operatives of the Russian government, because that's like the main thing. Like I've always been anti-NATO for
Same.
obvious reasons. I'm Turkish. I know what NATO has done in terms of in terms of its own version of Operation Gladio in Turkey, and how much of a formative role it played in Turkish politics and still does to this day. And that is where like a lot of my enmity brews against NATO. And of course, when I talk about NATO incursion immediately, or even just like the truth about what has taken place thus far with the ultimately unjustifiable and illegal invasion of Ukraine that Russia committed to, everyone always would be like, "Oh, you're just defending Russia."
Yeah, I get that a lot as well. And then I just come back with, I've been sanctioned. What has happened to you? I've put my body on the line in a way that they haven't, but they don't really cotton to that often.
So you're anti-NATO as well. So let's start
Yeah,
there.
sure.
Why are you anti-NATO, Daniel?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an important question because when people point to American hegemony or the American empire, one of the things that they'll point to as a representative of why this is a good thing is NATO. Famously, NATO was founded in 1949 to keep the Germans down, the Americans in Europe, and the Soviets out. And one could argue that NATO did that. But what I think it really represents is the fact of the United States remaining involved in global affairs as the hegemon in a way that, if you look at the historical record, has done incredible amounts of damage to the world, both over the course of the Cold War and after. And so actually going against NATO is a way to argue that the United States should allow other world regions, particularly very wealthy world regions like Europe, to determine their own politics and to determine their own approach to the military and to some degree the economy as well. So even if NATO is the quote unquote good part of empire, and personally I don't think there's ever such a thing as a good part of empire, going against it is a way to really articulate that you don't think the United States should be involved in other world regions to the degree that it has been, to say nothing of, NATO expansion helping engender Russia's Ukrainian invasion of Ukraine, the Ukrainian sounds like a WWE thing, and other negative consequences that it has had. But yeah, I think it's an important thing to be against, and an important thing to be against the United States dominating these forms of global alliances, because that's a form of American imperialism as well.
Yeah. So what do you have to say to people that would retaliate to what you're saying right now with the question, well, what about Baltic states? Like they all actually wanted to be a part of NATO. All these states wanted to be a part of NATO.
Yeah, and this is the whole empire by invitation argument. And for that, I just return to actual history and the amount of damage that the United States has done abroad. For example, during the Cold War, the US tried to overthrow regimes abroad about 66 times. And even if that didn't succeed, like it succeeded in Iran and Guatemala and Chile and elsewhere, even if you were just targeted by the United States, you were more likely to experience mass deaths, displacement, and things like that, to say nothing of what the United States has done since the end of the Cold War and the global war on terror. Millions of people directly dead as a result of the war on terror, millions of people indirectly dead as a result of the war on terror, deracination, displacement, and all of those things. And I think if you just look at actual history, you can't actually have the quote unquote good parts of the empire without the bad part of the empire. So what does that mean? In the short term, that means that there's going to be some negative things. For example, like Russia invading Ukraine or the Baltic states being threatened by Russia, right? This is a reality that people on the left can't ignore or deny and say, oh, Putin will never do it. Putin will never invade Poland. That's ridiculous. But Putin could very likely threaten the Baltic states. But again, what we on the left we need to look at structure, the actual structure and condition. And what that reveals, again, is that there's no such thing as just the good part of the empire without the bad part of the empire. They go together. So if you don't like Iraq, if you don't like Afghanistan, you don't like Libya, you don't like the United States having 750 military bases, to get that down, to not do in Iraq again, you're going to have to also face consequences in other world regions. It's just looking at the reality of the situation. And you're not going to get the world that you and I want to live in, this sort of humanistic world where everyone's equal, blah, 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 with the American empire still existing. And so I think what I tell people is to take a step back and look at it from a macro perspective and a historical perspective. I'm a historian.
Yeah. So outside of NATO and outside of Russia and Ukraine, which we will get back to, there's obviously two incidents that have taken place in the same administrative cycle under the Biden administration that I think has played a formative role in redeveloping the Western world's perspective on America's role in global affairs. On the one hand, as I like to say, America joined or was already a part of active initiatives to bring Ukraine into the sphere of Western influence. But America joined in the aftermath of the invasion of Ukraine, the side of the battle with Ukraine for the good side, if you want to use good bad dynamics there, is reductive for bad reasons. For the worst reasons, as a matter of fact. And I think that played a formative role in the continuation of the conflict. And we are now seemingly arriving at this conclusion that it's all lost and America's taking a big fat L here. And it seems like Donald Trump is trying to manage the empire in decline in the ways that he's doing. Some bad and some we'll see if it's good or not. But on the other side of that, you saw all of that goodwill that America could have cultivated in the process of we're defending Ukraine, no matter how heavy-handed it was and how much it damaged the European economy, for example. October 7 happened, I would say, as a direct consequence of the Abraham Accords and the continuation of that process under the Biden leadership and the expansion of the Israeli occupation and the allowance that the Trump administration gave that Biden continued. And then we saw that America does not care about the morality of the situation at all, which, of course, you and I never really thought that they gave a shit. No state actor really cares about the morality. They just have their own interests. But this, I think, has been this is almost created whiplash for a lot of people who did sincerely buy in to the manufactured consent to turn around and take a different approach to say maybe America's not the good guys in all of these circumstances. Maybe America's world police is not about creating free enterprise and a just world filled to the brim with democracy. Exactly. Because we associated ourselves and aligned heavily with Israel as it kickstarted its yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I just think to underline what I said, there's almost not as good an example to point to as the fact that you can't have the quote unquote good part of the empire without the bad. Almost immediately, the quote unquote good defense of Ukraine, which I think you're correct, was total bullshit. If you actually look at what Antony Blinken, Secretary of State, or Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said, they're basically, they said explicitly, we want to bog Russia down. The reason that we're involved in Ukraine, it's not for democracy. It's not for anything of this democracy versus authoritarianism stuff. It was just about bogging Russia down to make sure that something along the lines of Russia doesn't do what it did in Ukraine again. So it was really linked to these hard security interests and the United States' desire to be the imperial hegemon in every world always, which is ridiculous. And we could talk about China later if you want. But even if you were to say, it was a legal invasion, it was a terrible thing that Vladimir Putin did and that Russia did. And even if you want to say that it was good to defend against them, I mean, almost immediately after you get funding for the annihilation of Gaza, you get a total support for Israel's annihilation of Gaza. And there's just no starker example of the fact that the quote unquote good empire can be had without the quote unquote bad empire, which means you need to get rid of the empire. The problem is the empire. The problem is not how the empire is used. It's the structure of imperial rule itself. And that's what I think needs to be the lefty position on this.
Yeah. So let's see if there's any disagreements that we can find in this conversation. I don't think there really is any, but I'm trying to figure out if there's anything that I could if there's anything that you could elaborate further on as far as
Sure.
I guess it's not necessarily a disagreement, but is it more so a question what do you think? What do you think Joe Biden could have done, especially as it pertains to Russia's invasion of Ukraine? In
general.
or just in
Yeah.
general. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the thing is, I think it is reasonable to argue that what happens in terms of Europe, in terms of European war, is of direct interest to Europeans, and I think that one couldn't deny that. And so, what the United States should have done, and should have done, frankly, 30 years ago, after the end of the Cold War, and really probably didn't really need NATO in the first place. The more we learn about the Soviet Union, the more we discover that, for example, even Stalin wanted to make deals with the United States, and that the Cold War was essentially an American project. But just bracketing that, let's say you need a NATO
It was
throughout
Big
the
L
Cold
for
War, which I don't
Stalin.
necessarily. Big L for dude. Stalin got so fucked. Stalin thought he was going to be able to like make deals with Truman, and he was literally flabbergasted that the Americans were just like, "No, we're going to constantly encroach on your territory and not care about what you did whatsoever." not to rehabilitate Stalin. He wasn't a good guy, but there's more going on there. But the United States shouldn't have ever been as involved in European affairs. And so what Biden should have done is that he should have used this as an opportunity to begin a security transition. And I think this is what needs to happen over the next several decades. And it would have been nice if it started in Europe, because European countries are quite wealthy and they could actually produce a defense industrial base that would allow them to intervene in Ukraine if they consider this to be a major interest of themselves. If the British, if the French, if the Germans, if whomever, the Poles really want to intervene in Ukraine, that they should be the ones responsible for it, and it should not be the United States. So what Biden could have done was to begin a security transition. And why I think it's important to kind of focus in on that is that this is what also needs to happen in East Asia, because East Asia is really a powder keg that could go off at any moment. And you have people within the United States who are under the fantasy, who believe in the fantasy that the United States is going to be able to remain forever hegemonic in Asia, like it's 1945, and the United States controls half of the world's exports. This doesn't take account of the fact that, one, China is way more powerful than it was in 1945, but two, China is also in Asia. And things like Taiwan,
which is very noticeably close to our bases and our security interests, though. Like, why is it right there?
Right, and it's really rude of China to actually be in Asia. But it's important. How dare they? It raises questions about what do you do with something like Taiwan, which is like, and again, in an ideal world as leftists, I think we would both agree populations of a country should be allowed to determine what form of government they have. But unfortunately, we don't live in an ideal world, and we need to take seriously things like power and interest and geographic location. So it would have been nice if he started to draw down in Europe, because that would have begun a process and gotten people within the United States, particularly the American state, ready to do drawdowns around the world. And so that's what I would have advised Joe Biden to do. But I don't think Antony Blinken or Jake Sullivan agree with that position, because, as you know, Americans are under the fantasy that they could dominate the world forever, which is ahistorical and frankly ridiculous. Doesn't take account of basic facts like the US and the G7 just control less and less of world GDP. So there's like a kayfabe element to American foreign policy that I think really winds up preventing it from making wise choices.
Yeah. So the question here would be, do you believe that Russia has genuine ambitions of territorial expansion in Ukraine, or even further beyond Ukraine, and or is it simply a matter of defensive posture for maintaining its security interests in its own neighboring region? Because I do go back and forth on this a little bit. Go ahead.
I think you go back and forth because the right answer is both. I think Putin absolutely has a vision of greater Russia, going back to this notion of Kiev Rus, this medieval empire of which what is today the Russian Federation and independent Ukraine were a part, going back to the medieval period. And he does believe that these peoples are essentially the same people. They have the same culture, and they need to be united. He clearly believes that. I also, with regards to the 2022 invasion, I don't think COVID helped Putin's psychology. I think, from what I remember, he isolated himself seriously, and this probably helped encourage the invasion. So there's a psychological element there as well, which is difficult to analyze, but is certainly true. But I also think that NATO expanding far into Eastern Europe, and with various administrations, particularly George W. Bush, basically saying that Ukraine is going to join NATO was
And Georgia.
another cause. Yeah,
On
in
his
Georgia,
fucking
which
way out. He was like, it wasn't enough that I
Yeah.
fucked the entire planet. Like, let's also throw another blow in the direction of Russia too on the way out. Fantastic work.
it was crazy, and people in his administration being like, "Don't do that. Like, why would you do that?" Like Boris Yeltsin in the '90s told Clinton, "Don't do these things." But yeah. Anyway, and also that led to his invasion of Georgia, Putin's invasion of Georgia in 2008, almost immediately after. So I do think that NATO expansion was a cause of Putin's 2022 and 2014, for the 2014 invasion of Crimea and the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. Because you got to remember, Russians have long historical memories. Over the last 230 years, they've been invaded multiple times. First during the Napoleonic Wars, then during World War I. And this is something Americans don't know about. During the Russian Civil War, the United States, United Kingdom, and France dispatched troops to North Russia and further out parts of Siberia to defeat the Bolsheviks. After World War I, the U.S. sent troops to Russia to defeat the Bolsheviks. They also remember that. And then, of course, World War II with Operation Barbarossa. So there's a long-standing and understandable reason why Russia wants to have a security buffer zone. It's not totally insane for a Russian leader to want that. And I think that's was a major cause of the invasion.
So there's a long-standing tradition for sure, and long-standing animosity there. But having said that, what do you say to some of these counter narratives that people present, such as Russia actually had to invade because they wanted to defend the autonomy of LPR and DPR? 14,000 people were slaughtered in the process with this like back and forth artillery shelling. Do you feel like do you feel like that's just marketing for Vladimir Putin and also people who push Z pretty aggressively online?
Yeah, I do think that's a form of marketing, and no nation needs to expand in such a violent way, and I don't think that the Russian security was actually under any genuine threat in the short or medium term. I don't think and this is, again, what's so brutal about the United States. I think American leaders were just lying. I don't think they were ever going to let Ukraine or Georgia into NATO. I think that was total nonsense that they were essentially doing because the United States doesn't suffer the consequences of its policies. I mean, that's the fundamental truth of American empire, is that since the ending of the draft in the early 1970s, the bourgeoisie of the United States does not suffer the consequences of American foreign policy. We're incredibly insulated. And so George W. Bush could just be like, oh, okay, I'm about to lose. The Republican Party is about to be displaced, but let's have Ukraine and Georgia join NATO. Or various people within the Obama administration could make gestures toward this happening. And it's just total bullshit. And the people who wind up suffering, like always in U.S. foreign policy, are people abroad and not us here. We're just insulated from our hubris and our aggression, frankly, abroad.
With some exceptions, like 9/11.
Yeah, but I mean, the exception that proves the rule, you know, like 3,000 Americans versus 9/11 was horrible. You know, all the necessary disclaimers, innocent people should never be killed for the crimes of their government. But that just, again, reveals how, for the most part, it's not millions of Americans that are suffering as the result of the American empire. It's millions of people abroad.
No, absolutely. I famously have a very similar opinion. It's actually one day removed from one fateful evening in August 21st, 2019, when I said what I said about 9/11 that people still consistently bring up. But let's
two here.
Yeah, let's move on from that. So I guess my question is, or not even necessarily a question, but the thing that I've been thinking quite a lot about has been this Vladimir Putin summit that took place with Donald Trump. It's not a secret that Donald Trump has a lot of reverence for what he perceives as like charismatic, authoritarian strongmen, right? To a degree that I've never seen from any other American president, Republican or Democrat alike. presidents have had decent, much better relationships with foreign leaders, even adversaries in the past. But I've never seen someone have like an actual boner with respect to like the way he speaks on Vladimir Putin, especially someone who has much stronger terms for even the leader of a proxy like Zelensky. Where do you think this animosity towards Zelensky comes from for Donald Trump?
I think that Trump is a very personalist leader. He's not a policy guy. He's not a thinker. I think this is why it's kind of funny that so many people try to trace the intellectual history of Trump, because he's not a thinker. He's kind of an outer borough New York guy who made his career, one, due to his dad's money, but also by basically following his gut. And I think vis-a-vis Zelensky, I don't think he liked that he felt that the client in the weaker position didn't show the necessary deference to the guy who had the power. And I think it's as simple as that, which is why when Zelensky went to the White House recently, he wore that like black bar mitzvah suit. He was very deferential to Trump. And he was doing what he should have done when he came earlier in the last few months. And so I think that it's really just that. And
a reality that European leaders have actually come to terms with, because the first term under the Trump leadership, they were actively undermining him. They kept making fun of him. It was clear that they did not appreciate. It's clear that they were like, this guy's an idiot, which, I mean, he is. And these guys are right. Except that idiot does, run at least the Western sphere of influence. And therefore, you see a very different attitude from European leaders now, with like Rutte literally saying he's daddy. And all of these people that were around even or had an unfavorable opinion of Donald Trump now coming to terms with having to glaze Trump in an effort to get, like, I guess, in an effort to stop the bleeding to the best of their ability, which I don't think has seen much success anyway, especially with the universal tariffs regime that he's implemented, the economic deals that he's putting forth that look like tithing, like demanding more tithing from the vassal states, and I think that, yes, you're right. The relationship is just all about like how Trump feels about you and how you make Trump feel and stroke his ego. But beyond that, do you feel like Donald Trump has seen the writing on the wall about Ukraine's lack of manpower, for example? Because like if we're going to analyze the situation right now, my feeling after that Alaska summit was that this was truly the moment that spelled the end of singular hegemonic superpower America. This was like, we've talked about multipolarity existing in the world, and certainly there was in the Cold War, but this seems like it was the proof that multipolarity is here.
That's 1,000% correct. And I think what the most important thing to my mind there is that Putin was able to effectively, as far as we know, kind of sanction-proof Russia since 2014. And he was basically able to establish an alternative, not world order, it's not at that level yet, but an alternative space for Russia to interact in a way that it wasn't subject to the will of the United States totally. And I think you're exactly right. This is a transitional decade, and this is going to be looked back on by historians as a moment that indicated the United States is not, in sort of fancy terminology, the quote unquote unipolar power, or the hyperpower is another term that was, it's not the only game in town, that there are actual spaces that the United States doesn't dominate. Because basically what the Alaska summit demonstrated is that Putin doesn't really need to give the United States as much as he would have needed to 10 years ago, 20 years ago, that he's able to act with a freedom that was basically unthinkable relatively recently. And so I think that's true. And just to comment on the tariffs, I just think that, again, this is just another example of Trumpian nonsense, because you can't tariff goods and not do things like regulate monopolies or tariff financial transactions. In a world where the United States' economy is essentially organized around high finance and giant conglomerates, to tariff goods, it's pretending like you're living in 1890.
Yeah.
So I just like it's just all part of this. This is why, to some degree, and I hope I'm not proven wrong as I'm dragged away by stormtroopers one day. But I don't think that Trump is going to be able to put together the type of lasting coalition that an FDR or a Reagan was able to put together, because I mean, obviously, I'm a fan of FDR, not a fan of Reagan, but those guys were able to do things like pump money into the economy to help the average American. And everything Trump is doing is not doing that. So I think this provides an opening for leftists to really rethink and offer alternative visions of the world that might not come again if we don't take advantage of it, because the liberals just aren't able to do it. I mean, liberalism is in total crisis. They're not able to really offer anything that addresses the problems, whether we're talking about capitalism or imperialism or how people should even live their lives.
Yeah, I think that the question I guess I have is do you think Trump is going to, and we probably shouldn't speculate on America and Russian affairs. I feel as though both yourself, myself, and many others, including Zelensky himself, has been burned by making speculations about whether or not Russia really has that dog in them to go in and just like militarily dominate a country. A lot of people made predictions that came out to be wrong for once, and a lot of NATO enjoyers who are wrong professionally will never let you forget that. Having said all of that, do you feel like this is? Do you feel like the negotiations process, is it going to go anywhere? And also, do you feel as though Trump recognizes, or at least is like interested in communicating that this is over, that Russia has won, and that America made a bet thinking that it had its former superpower status and thought that it could just both economically and militarily dominate a foreign adversary by utilizing a proxy that was a standing nation state, a sovereign nation state like Ukraine, by offloading weapons into Ukraine with the hopes that like the battle lines would not look the way that they do right now, but instead just like push Russian troops back into the border and maybe have like active conflict there, and have that exist in perpetuity as the military industrial complex, it keeps racking up profits year over year.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the the stocks of the defense contractors since 2022, it's really crazy that they've just exploded. But in terms of your question, I think that Trump has a sense that this is not going to result in the type of American victory that an Antony Blinken or a Jake Sullivan, I'm not even sure Biden knew what was going on, expected, that they would be able to really bog Russia down forever, and Putin would not be able to sort of escape the purview of the United States, that we could sanction him, and that would be that. So Trump has a sense that that is not the case. But the issue is, I think what's the problem is that I'm not sure that Trump could offer Putin enough to get Putin to stop, essentially. On the other hand, I think this has been a grinding war for Russia as well. I mean, could you imagine the Soviet Union in 1970 not being able to just conquer Ukraine should Ukraine have rebelled like Hungary, East Germany, and Czechoslovakia did? No. So there's a relative decline in Russian power as well over the last 40 or 50 years. So that's why I think the thing to look out for is you don't want to get a Kashmir-like situation where it's just constant warfare. It bubbles up sometimes, it stops for a couple of years, then it bubbles up again. And that was what I was warning against from the very beginning in early 2022, that this could very easily turn into a horrible situation for actual people living on the ground there. Basically a state of permanent war. In a real way, not like the United States is always at war, even though we haven't declared war since 1942. Officially, we're always at war, but that you would have this bubbling up of conflict. And I don't think Trump is that interested in preventing that from happening, which to me seems like a likely outcome at this point, that it's kind of used by both the United States and Russia for domestic political purposes to shore up their own legitimacy, and Ukraine gets screwed in the short, medium, and long terms.
One thing that I've noticed in the way that Trump is communicating about this is that there's a little bit of a hand washing happening where he just keeps saying like, well, Vladimir Putin could take over the entirety of Ukraine if he wanted to, and that's what he wants. That's the apple of his eye. But this was Biden's war. This was Zelensky's war. They started it. I didn't start it. Vladimir Putin told me directly at the Alaska summit and over again that like I would have never invaded Ukraine if you were still the president, stuff like that. I mean, that's such a ridiculous that's such a ridiculous concession that you're extracting there for pure domestic favorability purposes in exchange for like basically recognizing that Russia has, to use a Trumpian term, Russia is holding all the cards, right?
No, they absolutely are.
Yeah,
and I think that Trump gets
exactly
that. Yeah.
And considering that we don't know the exact outlines of whatever this like proposal, this negotiation that's supposed to take place, the trilat, as Trump likes to call it, we don't consider like what we do know about some of the basic outlines and the fact that Ukraine and European leaders were seemingly very happy, and I don't know if they were faking it or if they were genuinely happy about the outcome so far. It feels as though there will still continue some kind of like insurgency initiative and weapons transfers that continue $100 billion specifically. I'm just not so certain as to why Russia would be on board with that. So it's not really going to look like a ceasefire at all, it seems. Well, they're just going to kind of call it a ceasefire, I guess, for domestic purposes.
Dude, I think you're totally right. I think we're heading towards that Kashmir-like situation where Ukraine is essentially a pawn for both the quote-unquote West, but the United States and the Western European powers especially, and Russia for domestic political reasons. And of course, the tragedy is that all the Americans who are just saying that fund Ukraine, don't negotiate in 2022 and 2023 are still going to all maintain their positions within the foreign policy establishment and within the media. I mean, to me, Ukraine just underlines a total lack of accountability for the commenters and makers of U.S. foreign policy. That's really disgusting. I mean, you see it going back to the Iraq War with people who advocated Iraq to still be in powerful positions. And the same thing is happening with Ukraine. We just live in a society without any accountability whatsoever. And that the people, the warmongers who keep on making terrible choices that backfire immediately suffer no professional or personal consequences. It's you and I who are lambasted by the Russian government, not the people who should actually be.
Yeah. So moving on from Ukraine, because actually, last thing on Ukraine before we get into Israel was my answer to the situation is that like the major power player here is still very much China, outside of the United States of America and the entire Western enterprise. You have this guy, you have this ginormous manufacturing base for the entire globe, basically propping up, at least, or economically helping, and even in some instances maybe militarily helping Russia continue being able to do this. And the way that I try to explain this to my audience, which is primarily comprised of Westerners, is like, a lot of the rest of the world that has been outside of the periphery of the West, the global South, see Russia as the enemy of my enemy is my friend. They see America and American dominance and Western imperialism as like a plague that has dominated their entire existence and their histories and humiliated them at times, even so that they see Russia as the tip of the spear, like the one country that's like crazy enough to militarily strike a blow at the Western Empire. Meanwhile, of course, ironically enough, Ukrainians are dying in the process, and they are the ones who suffer the most out of these decisions that like two larger powers are making here. Do you feel like there is like the most just solution to the best managed resolution to this process would be to bring China to the table as well, and to have a negotiations process where like China is also involved and offer more favorable deals to China instead of like continuing to adopt an even more hawkish attitude towards China, both economically and also trying to engage China militarily as well.
You're exactly right. I think one of the most damaging fantasies of U.S. foreign policy today is the idea that the United States will be able to remain a dominant power in East Asia. So anything that is going to bring China to the table as a major stakeholder in whatever world order that is going to emerge after U.S. hegemony is recognized to have totally declined is going to be important. Anything that brings American leaders together with Chinese leaders in a way in which the Americans recognize that they are the power in decline and that they're not going to be able to remain, they're not quite regionally hegemonic any longer, but regionally powerful in Asia, in East Asia is going to be a positive thing. And that's one of my biggest worries about U.S. foreign policy going into the future, is that the people who get recruited into both Democratic and Republican administrations, you basically can't really occupy an important position in either party if you don't think that the United States should remain forever dominant in East Asia. Even someone like John Mersheimer, who has been correct about Ukraine, thinks that the United States should confront China and that it's really important for the United States, which is ridiculous. It's just ridiculous. If you embrace the science of historical materialism and you just look at the material reality on the ground, there's just no way that's going to happen. What I'm worried about is that the United States is just going to actually cut and run one day, that China will do something super dramatic, whether it's an invasion of Taiwan or not, something else dramatic. US leaders will have done nothing to plan for this. They're going to recognize it's not worth fighting a nuclear World War III over an issue that's of tangential, ultimately, interest to the United States' physical security, and they're just going to leave the region, thereby leaving allies and partners totally in the lurch. When what should happen is this should be like basically a years-long process of preparing to leave the region in a meaningful and responsible way. But I don't think that there's any hope of that happening, because Americans are infected with a Protestant messianism that makes them identify the interests of the United States as being the interests of the world. So it's pretty grim. I mean, it's a pretty grim moment, even though the facts on the ground are so obvious.
There's like a dual-headed snake here as well, because like as domestic conditions worsen, like as material conditions worsen for the average American or the average Westerner, there's a lot less interest in feeling a sense of patriotism as well. On the one hand, you have more reactionary forces that grow out of the anger and resentment born out of the economic instability, the volatility, and a lot of hatred for the other, tribalist attitudes, white nativist immigration policies, and growing fascism. But I don't think the large swaths of Western society are as on board with like going to war with a larger power when they feel as though there's nothing to really fight for. It's like, oh yeah, I'm gonna go and die in a heated battle between America and China, so that or maybe survive so that I can come back to continue paying rent to my landlord. Like that's
Right.
that's not a life worth living, or that's certainly not a life worth fighting for, specifically fighting to death. So I think that is also somewhat crippling America's position around the global stage as well. And I guess the most reasonable outcome here after all of America's dominance around the world, I think, is like maybe scaling back in a way that's not dissimilar to the British Empire blowing a 13 colony lead and just like slowly becoming just an island full of weird reactionaries that do finance and is like and allow foreign capital to like purchase whatever they want over there so they can enter like the European markets.
Yeah, and to some degree, the sort of skepticism of going abroad is actually much more deeply felt, is a much more deep tradition in U.S. history than most people would expect, because like you and I grew up in an era of American hyperpower. People older than us, for the most part, grew up in the era of the Cold War, when the United States was super involved in international affairs. You took over a lot of those British bases, actually. FDR made a deal with the United Kingdom that during World War II, he would give them Lend-Lease aid in exchange for basically taking over the British bases. So to some degree, the U.S. just like stepped in for the United Kingdom. But before that, it's George Washington who warns against foreign entanglements. There's a real skepticism of leaving the Western Hemisphere for the first 175 years of American history. Now, it was never isolationist because, as you know, the United States, first you get westward expansion, the genocide of indigenous peoples, you get the total domination of Latin America, Central America, and the Caribbean in very brutal ways. And even during the War of 1898, you get the seizure of the Philippines and Guam and Puerto Rico as colonies, and the United States totally dominates Cuba. So it's not 100%, but something did change in 1945 when the United States really went global in a way that it never had before, and people were actually really against, but is normal to us. So to some degree, I think we're returning to the historical mean in the next 10, 20 years. It's just going to be difficult because we have this gerontocracy ruling us, which really is really into American global empire, even though it's done so many bad things for the world, really responsible for the deaths of millions upon millions of people. It's one should just, we were talking about the global South. I mean, just look at the numbers. Millions of people died as a direct result of American actions in the last 75 years. So it's not a surprise that they would, two cheers for Russia when it's combating what is perceived as an American war.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about another.
Now into the fun topic.
Yeah.
Israel.
Now let's talk about another incident that's being billed as a war, but it's actually something beyond a genocide. Israel's genocide of the Palestinian population. Israel has intensified its push to Gaza City, specifically trying to turn Gaza City into rubble, as it has done in Rafah and many other parts. The UN, as of last night, declared famine in North Gaza. Hold on, sorry, doors open. I apologize. I have the delivery coming in. I wanted to play a quick video from. I wanted to play a quick video for both of us to look at. UN accuses Israel of using hunger as a weapon as famine is declared in Gaza City.
Across Gaza, there is hunger, and now that suffering has a new name, famine. A United Nations-backed report says it has taken hold in parts of the Gaza Strip. 500,000 people are facing catastrophic shortages of food, with the crisis deepening by the day. And the United Nations blames Israel, saying it has blocked aid and used hunger as a weapon.
It is a famine that we could have prevented if we had been allowed. Yet food stacks up at borders because of systematic obstruction by Israel. It is a famine within a few hundred meters of food in a fertile land.
Near Gaza City, food is handed out at soup kitchens. These are meagre amounts that are supposed to sustain a family. The mortality rate is horrendous. Every day, of 10,000 people, 2 will die because of hunger. When aid does come, there's a scramble of people running towards pallets dropped from planes or fighting to get on the back of lorries to grab a bag of flour. This man is 75 years old. He is painfully thin.
Before the war, I weighed around 70 kilos. Now, because of malnutrition, 40. I suffered both a stroke and a heart attack. They had to put in a stent to help me recover. I thank God my organs are still functioning.
The Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, dismissed the report as an outright lie and said the problems in Gaza are caused by Hamas. For many Israelis, there is limited sympathy for Gaza.
Look at that. Make Gaza Jewish again.
It's just our country's directly responsible for this. It's just horrible to even comprehend.
Yeah. So this has had, as someone who has been an advocate for Palestinian emancipation for my entire professional media career for the past decade plus, I have never seen such a dramatic attitude shift against Israel. Even in places like the United States of America, where like our numbers are far worse in terms of favorability and unfavorability towards Israel in particular than like other countries, even other Western nations. But even here, obviously, the overwhelming majority recognize what Israel is doing as wrong. and even a majority of the population now also see the truth that Israel is doing a genocide. Why do you think America has attached itself to the hip with this suicidal, fascist, genocidal state?
There's several different reasons. So I think partially it goes back to gerontocracy, that a lot of the party leaders and a lot of the people who are in positions to make decisions were politicized and basically professionalized in an era where to go against Israel was to risk your political career flat out. From the 1970s onward, the power of the Israel lobby when you're talking about the Democratic Party, the power of the Christian Zionist lobby when you're talking about the Republican Party made it very difficult for any politician to make a career in this country if they were to go against Israel. And oftentimes, as sad as it is, a lot of U.S. foreign policy is directly linked to domestic politics. So I think that's really going on. That's really crucial here. I think there's also larger geostrategic reasons. First, there's racialized reasons. The notion that Israel is sort of a white redoubt in an era, in a region of brown barbarism is actually really important and is deeply held in American foreign policy, which has been racist for a long time and continues to be racist going forward. So that's an ideological reason. There's also the geostrategic reason, which I think Israel is viewed as a bastion of the American empire, again, in the Middle East. And this is most important vis-a-vis Iran, which the United States has been basically attacking since 1979 because we installed the brutal Shah after we overthrew Mossadegh in 1953. And was a Cold War fought through proxies, but since Trump attacked Iran, now a hot war. And so there's this geostrategic idea that Israel provides a base for the United States to be in the region in a more powerful way than even literal bases in Saudi or Egypt or wherever the case may be. And so I think those are primarily the reasons why it seems like the American political elite, until incredibly recently, tied itself so closely to Israel. Beyond that, before the era of social media, you didn't see it. You didn't see it to the same degree that you see it now, what apartheid in the West Bank looks like, or what now genocide in Gaza looks like. You didn't see it to the degree that you do now. And I think that's a genuine major cause. If you're scrolling Twitter and you just see murdered children, starving people over and over again, you begin asking yourself, what type of country is doing this? What type of country supports another country doing this? And I think that Netanyahu, just to take a step back, has really overplayed his hand, because I do think there's a gigantic emergent generational divide between basically people under 45 and people over 45 when it comes to Israel. And I do think going forward, you're going to see less and less support for basically allowing Israel to do whatever they want. The problem, the tragedy of it, though, is I think that Israel might very well succeed in this Likud project, this Jabotinsky project, to create greater Israel. And by the time there's this shift in American politics, and like the famous book says, everybody is now against this, everybody will one day always be against this, it'll be too late. And so this is really a tragic situation in the original meaning of the term.
Absolutely. Do you feel as though Chris Hedges has this mindset that it's and I've in our interviews he brought this up as well, where he feels like it's completely gone, that there is no solution here beyond like Israel is going to complete its genocidal project here, and America is going to try and actively provide political cover as it's done so far. And it will create a lot of animosity against the American government and against the Western governments as well. And it's clear to me, at least, that like some European leaders who still try to maintain the optics of like being bastions of liberal democracy and defenders of like international human rights are trying to at least offer some kind of exit ramp, a pressure valve release by saying we're going to recognize that nature. Whereas America is, especially under the leadership of Donald Trump, not even choosing to offer any sort of olive branch to those who see the horrifying realities of Israel's genocide and demand stopping said horrifying realities. Do you feel like this is where we're headed towards, that it's going to, or is there any sort of counter messaging operation or any sort of like initiative movement that people could take that could potentially set back Israel's genocidal ambition in Gaza?
Well, I mean, I think, first of all, optimism of the will, but I think with this one, pessimism of the intellect, because I think it's very difficult to see how there would be a transformation in U.S. foreign policy toward Israel. But I mean, obviously, this is a terrible situation. But if one thing positive could come out of it, I think people could really appreciate the undemocratic nature of U.S. foreign policy and the degree to which ordinary Americans have almost no say over what their country does abroad. And I just want to stick on that for a second, because this was a conscious choice made in the late 1940s when the United States was creating its modern state to create institutions like the National Security Council, like the Central Intelligence Agency, and eventually the Department of Defense, which were constantly separated not only from public opinion, but from congressional opinion. So you can have a moment, even within the Democratic Party, when most Democrats are against whatever the United States, not whatever, the United States allowing Israel to do whatever it wants. Most people could be against that, and it doesn't matter, because we don't, in a lot of issue areas, we do not live in a democracy.
Yeah.
And I think people really need to understand that, because understanding that is the first step toward actually changing it, to creating the type of world where we could say, no, we're not going to support genocide. We're not going to support apartheid,
Yeah.
and actually having policymakers listen, because we don't live in a democracy, not in a real democracy. And hopefully this will help people realize that. That's the only positive benefit, because right now I don't see how things could change otherwise.
Yeah.
I don't think protests are enough. I don't think letter writing campaigns are enough. And it just is really a terrible and tragic situation. That doesn't even do justice to it. It's beyond that. It is beyond that.
Americans have been kept in the dark about American foreign policy by design. At least that's my assessment of the situation. Deliberately kept in the dark, because if they were to recognize the violent nature of American dominance, especially in the global South, that contributes in very meaningful ways into them getting like $5 T-shirts at Forever 21 or whatever, some people would probably be understandably angry towards it, and maybe others would actually land on the side of permanent warfare as a constant state. But because of that, there is somewhat of an opportunity here, because many Americans, while benefiting from being a part of the labor aristocracy or being in the imperial core, still very much have this weird opinion where they're anti-war. They fancy themselves to be anti-war. Donald Trump took advantage of that when he was running against the more cold and calculated and perhaps more serious tone that Kamala Harris took when she said she wants a more lethal military. She's going to have the most lethal military and whatnot. And I do agree with you as far as like this being an issue that definitely wakes up a lot of people to how little say they have in the process of this quote unquote democracy, especially in liberal capitalist states. I feel as though specifically with Israel, like for people that think this is just foreign policy, what is that supposed to do with me? Oh, it's just like Muslims and Jews. They've been fighting, ahistorical shit that they say, like they've been fighting for decades or centuries, thousands of years. It's wrong. I think the lack of democracy is ever present in domestic agendas as well, that many people have somehow deluded themselves under our duopoly into thinking like, no, there's marginal improvements that one party can make over the other. But when it comes down to universal things like Medicare for all, clearly something that like the overwhelming majority of Americans want and demand, they're not getting it. So something's got to change.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the many reasons that people feel a little nuts today, because we're way more politicized as a culture than we ever were. People talk more about politics in the 2020s than they did in the 1980s and the 1990s. But as we talk more and more about politics, we have less and less ability to affect policy. So you get this strange situation where everyone's politically motivated, but there's no actual avenue for genuine policy change. And it leads to a type of corroded society where where everyone kind of feels insane all the time because we talk about this all the time, but nothing ever changes. And so the positive thing of that is that we could recognize that you're totally right. Americans don't decide the macro economy of this country, what this country invests in, the various incentives it gives to companies, the fact that it gives SpaceX all these government contracts, which are built on NASA, i.e. government funded research and things like that. We have absolutely no say in that. And the story of the United States over the course of the 20th century is a story of de-democratization. Ironically, as the franchise expanded, first to women in the 20s and then to all Black Americans in the 1960s and beyond, ironically, as the vote expanded, democracy went away. And I don't think those two are not related. As more and more people were given the vote, the actual ability to change things was ironically reduced. And this is the fundamental tension of what it means to be an American interested in politics in 2020. And we need to change 2025. And we need to change it, because if we don't, we're just going to be getting more Israels. We're just going to be getting more landlords, higher inflation. Everything is more difficult. No one could afford rent. No one could afford a house. And even if we're able to consume cheap calories and cheap pornography, it's not worth it. It's not worth it. And we need to change it.
Yeah. And obviously the treat economy only takes you so far when everything else is on fire at all times. And if one party is recognizing that frustration that people experience and then redirecting it back to like vulnerable targets that have historically been very effective at undermining, like, you know, Nazis in like fascist in Nazi Germany and prioritizing Jews in society as like the primary enemy, the arch villains, and socialism or Jewish Bolshevism as like the thing that was disrupting the very fabric that was holding the Volk-backed German society together. The right, the reactionary politicians in our day and age are doing a very similar thing, if not damn near identical. And this time they're doing it in the direction of immigrants. The process, even
Precisely.
the legal process that they utilize, is actually not dissimilar, if not completely identical to what Nazi Germany did as well. The denaturalization process of like creating a permanent state of like statesless people that you can just dominate and either use as slave labor, or if it's opportune for your propaganda purposes, use them as like the arch villains that are responsible for all of the economic hardships that you're experiencing. And so some people do actually abide by that. Some people do go along with this like comfortable narrative that it's not the impossible to change systems that are actually designed to dominate the overwhelming majority of workers living in American society, but instead it's actually the migrants, or it's the trans people, or it's people that are just like don't understand the living conditions of, even if they are completely aligned on class interests. I guess one last question that I have, because you want to talk about China. Having said all of that, do you...
Hasan, can I just say something really quickly?
Go ahead.
Just two things happened in March 2003. The U.S. invaded Iraq and ICE was founded. Those things go together. And I think it's just very clear that they rely on each other. Sorry, please.
Yeah. Oh, no, absolutely. Foreign policy always plays an incredibly important role in domestic policy in the lives of Americans. At its most base, like every dollar spent on a rocket is a dollar that could go back to American infrastructure, a dollar that could go back to our education, a dollar that can go back to building roads and a robust infrastructure that we could rely on. And yet we don't treat it as such. I guess the other side, now that we talked about the Republicans before we get to China, the other side, on the liberal side, there's this delusion that necessitates them like treating the population as like silly and childish, that makes it seem like their anger and resentment and the economic hardships that they're facing are actually totally ridiculous. So if one side is not actively channeling the frustration towards more productive avenues, because if this was a true left flank, if this was a true left party, they would say it's the millionaires and billionaires, it's the corporate oligarchs that have designed society in this way, because they're also funded by the same corporate benefactors. They don't do that, but the other side at least like recognizes the frustration, Republicans, and then redirects it to vulnerable populations, marginalized populations, and then ultimately you have this growing fascist movement in the country.
I mean, I think that's totally right. And I think that indicates nothing more than the crisis of liberalism, which the Democratic Party represents. One of liberalism's historical strengths is that it was able to incorporate criticism. That's what FDR was. FDR was essentially a liberal who incorporated the social democratic criticism. To some degree, that's what Ronald Reagan was. Ronald Reagan was a liberal who incorporated the criticism of the stagnation of the Fordist economy at the mid-century. What's interesting about liberals today is that they can't even brook criticism. I remember, I'll never forget it. After Trump won in 2016, the New Yorker ran a cartoon, which was like a guy standing up on the plane being like, I know better than the pilot, let me fly the plane, which was just a total dismissal of why anyone would be radicalized to the degree to vote for such an anti-systemic candidate like Donald Trump. They don't take it seriously. And that's due, like you said, because they're funded by the same people. But there's also this sort of like oligarchization process, meritocracy thing, where the Democratic Party is essentially staffed by people who went to the Ivy League institutions and associated institutions, people who are so separate from what ordinary Americans understand that the party literally cannot comprehend how an ordinary person lives. So you need a total transformation of the party. The party is a cancerous rot right now.
Yeah, there's a complete infantilization of like the large majorities of the population, and I mean, I understand like to a certain degree that people are not making educated decisions when they're voting, but that's partially born out of the fact that we do have this duopoly that is actually uniparty on a lot of the issues that matter.
The left and right sides of capital.
But
famously.
even then, like the dumbest person on the planet still understands when they are experiencing harm. So there is this like directionless anger that people have, and you can either, like I always say, direct it at those who are causing you harm, or direct it at those who are marginalized and can be easily cast aside as like villains in society when they're not playing that role at all. As a matter of fact, when they're utterly powerless.
I mean, you just saw it very quickly with the fact that they tried to tell you that Biden wasn't in mental decline. That's just a sign of disrespect to people. Don't believe your lying eyes.
Yeah, no, exactly. But let's talk a little bit about China as well before I let you go, because thank you for being on here for an hour. This is a wonderful conversation. What do you think about China's rise in this past decade, in the past 2 decades especially, and its role as a power player in the global marketplace?
To some degree, it's a return to normalcy. If you look at the grand sweep of international relations, China was always a major player. And the strange thing was that it wasn't a major player for a couple of hundred years due to various contingent historical circumstances. It's unique that basically, since 1492, that the West, or more accurately, the global North, and even more accurately, the North Atlantic world wound up being dominant. That's kind of a historical outlier when you're looking at the last 5,000 or so years of history. So to some degree, it's a return to normal. I mean, the big question with China is it genuinely trying to move toward a more communist world? Or after Deng, did they just decide that the only way that you could actually interact in the world is as another major power, and that you could take care of your country, you could develop your country, you could try to control your region and push it in a particular direction, but the sort of dream of a universalistic communism is just, the world just isn't ready for that. And to me, that's the big question of China. Is China just a state capitalist society, or is it a state capitalist society that is trying to foster a transition to something like a more equal communism? And I think it's an open question right now. It seems more state capitalist, but I hope that I'm wrong with that. When it comes to international relations, it's just going to dominate East Asia. That is the reality of the situation. And like I've said a couple times, the United States needs to accommodate itself to that reality. It shouldn't fight World War III over things that are of tangential interest to this country, even if in an ideal world, Taiwan or Hong Kong or what have you, the people there would be able to determine their own form of government. That's the world we want, with that genuine democracy. But in the world that it actually exists, the United States shouldn't fight World War III over it. And I worry that American officials don't recognize that, and they really need to.
Yeah, I think we're definitely in agreement that like one of the major issues that's already unfolded and will continue to become even larger, more consequential problems is like America's inability to recognize that it no longer has the same amount of power around the globe. And empires don't die quietly. They go out. They don't go out in a fizzle. It's a long and very violent process usually. And I think America is going to become increasingly more belligerent, and not in the ways that, I mean, America's always been belligerent, but at least like belligerent in a way where they can still like maintain the optics of stability as the world police. But now, especially in cases like with Russian retaliation in some ways, or Russian expansion interests, and America's inability to address those things militarily is creating this unique predicament where there's just a continuation of conflict, which might actually help in the interim, in the short term, for corporate super profits. And you see this with like Anduril and Palantir and all of these like Silicon Valley tech companies now entering the military industrial complex in more meaningful ways than they ever did before, because they want a piece of that last remaining pie, I guess. But all of that leads to more militarism, and all that leads to more bloodshed, and I don't know. I feel it just seems like if you're not under the protective banner of like nuclear arms, if you're not under like a nuclear security treaty, you're just going to look like Ukraine. There's going to be more and more Ukraines all around the world.
I mean, look at Kim Jong-un versus Gaddafi, right? And this is the classic instance, right? One of them has nuclear weapons, one of them didn't. And this is one of the things that I think you might see happen in Iran. I think it wouldn't be a surprise if many Iranian leaders decide that they need to go full on for a nuclear program, particularly after Trump bombed them and Israel bombed them. This was an argument made by a political scientist named Kenneth Waltz maybe in early 2010s, but he essentially said the most stable world would be one in which there was actually nuclear proliferation, because it would prevent the type of foreign adventurism that you saw in Afghanistan and Iraq and in Libya or Vietnam or Korea or what have you. And I don't think that argument is absolutely absurd. I think a lot of history demonstrates that, but that's not a good thing, because nuclear weapons or a nuclear war could actually destroy humanity in a genuine way. And it's difficult for us to feel that because it's been so long since one was dropped in war, but it could really destroy humanity, not necessarily from annihilation, but from engendering a global famine. These are real things that could really happen. And so this is why the left needs to win and push the state in a good direction.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, last question about China. In terms of your calculations about whether China is honestly a transitional socialist state that wants to build global communism, or simply self-interested and maybe hyper pragmatic, possibly because of their analysis of what they consider that the USSR did wrong, and their focus is becoming an irreplaceable world power by trade and soft power initiatives rather than any sort of like military dominance. With respect to Israel, China is still very much the second largest trading partner of Israel. This is, Israel relies on Chinese commerce. Do you feel like they could take a more active stance against Israel beyond writing sternly worded letters every few weeks about how angry they are about Israel's genocide?
Oh, of course they could. The question is, why aren't they? And that, I think, leads to more pushing into China viewing itself as a more quote unquote pragmatic, realist power when it comes to international relations. It does not seem to me that China envisions itself as the exporter of global revolution that Mao might have imagined in the 50s and the 60s. And I think its policy vis-a-vis Israel suggests that when it comes to the world stage, at least in the 2020s, it's going to act like a pragmatic, realist power and try to basically protect itself and pursue what it perceives as its own national military and security and economic interests. And Israel provides a salient example of that. I think it's the exact right way to view it, like you said.
They don't even take advantage of potential like-minded, like ideologically aligned militia movements in their own backyard. If they wanted to cause like some semblance of instability or even like an American-style military coup, they could use the Philippine Maoist movement, and yet they've actively undermined the Maoist movement in the Philippines and worked with an American-backed dictatorship against the Maoist movement. So like I feel like they're pragmatic to a fault in some instances. But then again, who am I? I'm just some random dickhead living in the United States of America. I'm not Xi Jinping, you know? Maybe he knows something I don't.
I mean, very similar to Stalin, right? Right after World War II, Stalin didn't really support the Chinese Revolution. You know, went back and forth on the Greek communists. So I think overall macro take is that since the 30s, no communist country has really imagined itself as the exporter of global revolution. I think this is when I joke, half joke, that all was lost in 1914 when the working classes of Europe fought each other, because that shouldn't have happened. And the state was immature enough when the working class could have actually taken it over in a meaningful way. But that's a conversation for another time. But it does not seem like that they imagine themselves
the
as
German Revolution could have dramatically altered the trajectory of humanity.
It was supposed to happen there, man. It was not supposed to happen in Russia. It was supposed to happen in Germany.
Yeah. All right. Well, Daniel Bessner, thank you so much for coming on the broadcast. This was enlightening. This was an incredible conversation. I hope to have you on again. Is there anything you want to plug before I let you go?
Yeah, please, everyone, check out my podcast, American Prestige, at AmericanPrestigePod.com. We've got a really good episode this week with Glenn Lowry, and we've got one with Rashid Khalidi coming out on Tuesday. And this Sunday, we're talking about Ukraine. So if you like foreign affairs, please check out American Prestige. Again, American Prestige Pod. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, just dbessner is my Twitter name. And Hasan, I just want to say thanks for doing all this good work, man. Really appreciate it. You're fighting the good fight, and thanks again for having me on.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. Bye.
Bye.
All right, that was Daniel Bessner of American.